Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show on television. Here on The Point of View, we get the right guests. We ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. And today we're focusing on a new report released by the World Bank. It's called Africa's Pulse, an analysis of issues shaping Africa's economic future. And we're very privileged to have the chief economist for Africa for the World Bank, Andrew Dabalen, to give us some insight into this new report, tell us how we should feel about the next quarter and whether there's light at the end of the tunnel or not. We'll be right back with the interview. Stay with us. Welcome back. So tonight, The Point of View is going continental. We're talking about Africa. We're testing the pulse of the continent on the economic level. We know we've had many difficulties in the past few years. COVID was terrible. 2022 was a difficult year as well. Inflation was going through the roof. In Ghana, it was over 50%. It's now halved, but there are lots of concerns across the continent. Nigeria is having currency challenges. South Africa has power crisis ahead of its elections. Kenya is on a program. Zambia as well. So who best to talk to than the World Bank's chief economist for Africa, Andrew Dabalen. Andrew, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening to you.
Wow. When I was young, I wanted to be a chief economist for the World Bank, but I realized I didn't have the aptitude for it. That must be a big position. What does a chief economist for Africa for the World Bank do?
Thank you, Bernard. The chief economist for the Africa region, we do three things. We monitor what the economic and financial developments in the Africa region. This is particularly around sub-Saharan Africa because North Africa is covered by a different office. We do research on big strategic issues. We look at, whether digital technology adoption has created jobs and reduced poverty, or, how to accelerate energy access in Africa, and a whole range of questions that are important for development in Africa. And then third, we try to engage African institutions in the continent, the universities, the think tanks, regional organizations, in terms of just coordinating our dialogue and our research in the region.
Wonderful. Africa is such a diverse place. Even with SSA, there are countries with very small populations and there are huge countries with different kinds of economies. I'm sure it must be interesting trying to aggregate trends and look at patterns across such a diverse, almost, 45 countries, if you take out the North Africans. That must be a challenge. How do you go about it?
Yeah, so you're pointing to a very important issue here, because, even though there are actually 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and if you add, the 5 or 6 countries, then it becomes 54 countries, I think. Now, the way we do this is we do represent averages. Of course, as you mentioned, Africa is a very diverse continent with very large, very small, landlocked, coastal, small island states, and so on, right? So it's very difficult. So we always make sure that when we send our messages that are really about continental averages, that we remind people that in fact there is a lot of heterogeneity, meaning there is a lot of variation in these outcomes that we present, and so that is important to keep in mind in all our messages.
Which is why interviews like these are important, and we thank you for joining us. So this pulse is for April. How often do you release the pulse, and what does it look at? What do these pulses look at?
Right. So the purpose of the pulse is to try and because economic issues change so frequently, what we do is we try to monitor what's happening on the continent on a regular basis, and then every 6 months we try to update our knowledge of what's going on, right? So the Africa's Pulse is a biannual report. It's produced once in October and once in spring of every year. And this usually coincides around the time when policymakers, central bankers, international development organizations, civil society organizations meet to take stock of development issues around the world during the meetings of the World Bank and the IMF member countries, right? So what we call the annual meetings in October and spring meetings in April. And around that time, we release these reports precisely to remind people and to update people about the recent developments. So the purpose of the pulse is twofold. One is to monitor and to update our knowledge on a frequent basis. And the other one is to highlight a particular topic that is not really urgent at the moment, but important for policymakers to keep in mind. So the pulse has two parts. If you pick up a copy of the pulse, and I encourage your listeners and your readers to do so, it has two parts. The first part is what we call near-term macroeconomic outcomes. And what we do in that part is we look at evolution and recent developments of things that are changing rapidly, what we call high-frequency economic statistics and indicators. So these are things like GDP, which changes every quarter, things like inflation, which changes every month sometimes, or every week, things like debt, which can change, very frequently depending on developments between the countries and their creditors, right? And so on, right? So these are very, frequently changing indicators, and so we try to capture them. Exchange rates change all the time, so we capture those. But the second part of the report usually looks at a structural issue, something that is deep in the structures of these economies that is really important for economic success for the countries. That could be, and in this particular pulse, we look at inequality because we think that inequality is tightly linked to a number of things we see in Africa, specifically lack of mobility, intergenerational mobility, and the fact that, in fact, growth remains low and unsustained for long periods of time.
Wonderful. And I think I'll borrow that structure in this interview, starting with the high-frequency economic indicators. Even the subtopic for your press release is interesting. African economy projected to grow 3.4% 2024, but faster and more equitable growth needed to reduce poverty. So in a sense, the first part of that construction is part one, and the second part is the long term. This 3.4% growth rate in 2024, put it into context. Is it higher than expected? Is it lower than expected? And will it do the job of lifting people out of poverty?
Very good. So compared to the last 3 years, this is obviously a positive development because in the last 3 years, what we've seen, as you've studied in your introduction, we've seen first a pandemic, then a war that led to a lot of inflation. We had a global geopolitical crisis. We had droughts and so on and so on, right? So we in a way we've been managing a number of crises, poly-crises we could call it, that have piled on top of each other. And all those years, all we've seen is a lot of economic hardship. So for the first time, I think in 4 years, we're beginning to see a rebound of the economic activity. Last year, we estimated growth to have been 2.6% in Africa on average. We can talk about specific regions that have outperformed that average and others that have not. But on average, it was 2.6% last year. Yeah. And then this year, we see it's rebounded to 3.4%. And our forecast is that in 2025, it will be about 3.8%. Now, what we're saying is that this is a good development, it's positive, and we can talk about in subsequently the link between inequality, but this is in general, if you just account for population, not completely unusual, right? Because in the last decade, we've actually seen that if you account for population, African growth has been less than or around 1% in per capita terms. So this will be in the ballpark in that sense. But it is positive news compared to the last 3-4 years. Okay. So that's important to acknowledge. And what we're saying is that it is primarily driven by the recovery in private consumption, because inflation has come down substantially in a lot of these countries, because of a normalization of global supply chains, a steady decline in commodity prices, and the impacts of these reforms that countries have done in order to make sure that in order to bring inflation down, interest rates should stay up, right? So those are some of the drivers.
That's important, but I think the point you make about the usefulness of the growth is where we come to the question of whether even GDP is still as relevant a measure, because we've seen, and I heard you in a previous interview talk about how in some countries they've had growth, but that growth leads to poverty reduction, it leads to more equality. So GDP in and of itself may not be a very useful tool for human well-being. It is useful to get a sense of the overall economy on aggregate, but if you really want to improve lives, GDP or GDP per capita may not really be the way to go. Then the second point I wanted to make for you to address is, you make an important point in the report that in many parts of the world, a 1% growth in GDP has to have a certain percentage reduction in extreme poverty, for example. But in our case, in the region, it's basically 1% and 1%. In other parts of the world, it's 2.5 or more. Can you comment about the usefulness of GDP generally, and then why in Africa the multiplier effect or the translation of GDP into poverty reduction is so slow or small?
So I think the use of GDP has been tested over time, and it has proven durable and useful. So I don't want your listeners to get the impression that GDP is not a useful concept. GDP is a measure of economic activities in a country that is taking place within the borders of a country, right? So what we do is we measure, so for example, how much oranges are produced, how much cocoa is produced, or how much services are provided, how much education activity is taking place, right? So these are really important markers of our modern society. And so measuring that is crucial. Now, we can talk about, is this methodology, can this methodology be improved? Can it get better? Are there some things that are not included? So, for example, the contribution of informal sector, is it measured properly? Well, some people will say maybe there are some ways in which we can improve the contribution of the informal sector to economic activity. Is the contribution of women's work, which is not captured in the market, is that included in the GDP? In many cases, not. But could we measure that better? Of course we could, right? So we can always talk about how we can improve on the GDP, but the core concept itself is very, very important, and is a very good measure of what a society's economic activity looks like, in terms of structure, in terms of composition, in terms of valuation, right? So I think that is important to remember. Now, so having said that, I think the way we want to think about welfare in general is that this is this concept of GDP captures the monetary dimensions of well-being, right? So it's the material goods that are produced, the services that are produced. But there are a lot of other things about human welfare that is not necessarily monetized. So the value you get from education, the value you get from just good health, right? Those things cannot be monetized. So the importance of good health cannot be monetized. The importance of the beauty of just the joy of knowing in terms of knowledge, and which education can give you by reading good novels, something like that, is not something you can monetize, right? Social connections is not something you can monetize, right? And yet they're very important, right? Friendships, and so on, right? And sense of community. So those things are crucial, and they are not necessarily captured in GDP, but they're very important in well-being. We capture them in other ways in economics. We call them non-monetary dimensions of well-being. So those things are measured in different ways, but they're not necessarily captured in the GDP statistics that you see.
Wonderful.
So that's the point I want to make about GDP.
Okay.
Now,
yes. The second part of the question has to do with
the second part of the question is about now if we accept that we can use GDP to talk about the economic activities of a country. So then what we find in this report is that African growth it has been traditionally low compared to other regions that have been in the same situation as Africa, such as East Asia, for example, and increasingly South Asia. And it has been very difficult to sustain over long periods of time. So just to give you a marker, if in fact, let's say, countries in Asia and Africa went through a recession, right? There's an economic downturn like we've experienced. And let's say there's a recovery. The recovery in Africa typically lasts maybe 3 years, and then a shock comes and it falters, right? It doesn't get sustained. A recovery in East Asia takes about 8 years before it falters. So that's a huge difference, right? In terms of so not only do you find that African growth is lower, you also find that it is not sustained over long periods of time. And because of that, it has been extremely costly. Just to give you an example for your listeners and your audience, if African growth was sustained at the rate at which it grew, it's not high, but even if it was just sustained at the rate at which it grew between 2000 and 2014, right? That window of 14 years, African families will be 35% richer than they are now.
Wow.
Okay? So that's the kind of thing that gives you, a sense of just how completely costly this low growth has been, right? So that's one thing. Now, the other thing we notice is that if 1% change and this is what you pointed out, the 1% change in African growth is really only operating at half speed when it comes to poverty reduction, right? In the sense that it translates to 1% poverty reduction. 1% growth leads to 1% poverty reduction. In East Asia, it's much higher than that. And the rest of the world on average is about 2.2%. So that's why I said African, the speed at which African growth reduces poverty reduction is only half what we see in the rest of the world. And what we say is that one of the major culprits, one of the major reasons for that is this, what we call structural inequalities in this report. Okay? Now, there are many reasons why African growth is low. Part of it is we don't have very good infrastructure in terms of energy, water and sanitation. We don't really trade a lot with each other. We have lots of shocks, either from, commodity prices or conflict or climate disasters. We have all that. But I think one of the understated and kind of important determinants of this low growth and this ability of low growth to convert to poverty reduction is inequality and structural inequalities. What we mean by that is these are inequalities that are not, they are inequalities because of circumstances an individual cannot control. Okay? You don't have control over where you're born. You don't have control over who you're born to. You don't have control over your skin color or the fact that you are a man or a woman, right? But these are the things, these circumstances that you're born into, you're born with, account for almost 70% of all the differences you see between children's access to education or health or nutrition, right? So that's what we call structural. It's not something that you can change with your effort or your ability or something that a market can correct. It requires social policy action in order to change that.
Brilliant. Andrew, thank you. We'll take a short break and come back. We're talking to Andrew Dabalen, who's the Chief Economist for Africa for the World Bank, and we're speaking to the latest Africa Pulse report, which is showing the growth rate that we should see, but with a lot of caveats. When we come back, we'll try and cross a few T's and dot some I's, and also try and understand or look at some possible prescriptions for how Africa can really make its growth more inclusive and more poverty reducing. Stay with us. Welcome back. The point of view tonight is taking a continental view of things. We're reviewing the latest analysis of issues shaping Africa's economic future. It's called Africa's Pulse. It's released twice a year in spring, that's April, thereabout in October. Don't forget, next week is the spring meetings. We're happy to have Andrew Dabalen, who's the Chief Economist for Africa for the World Bank. A few highlights for you. Growth is set to bounce back in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the recovery is still fragile. Lower inflation is supporting the economic rebound in the region. We'll comment a bit about that. The contribution of global drivers of growth remains subdued and uncertain. That's a big worry, because you can say some of the inflation was global. Supply chain issues, the Fed reducing their rates, all of that affected, or increasing their rates, by the way, affected some of the African currencies. Fiscal balances are improving, but at a moderate pace. The debt question is there. Growing debt service obligations are creating liquidity problems and crowding out development spending, which is funny. All the points being made are very true for Ghana. So you think Ghana is like a great case study for all the macro points being made. Growth headwinds are compounded by escalating conflict and violence. And then tackling structural inequality to revitalize growth and accelerate poverty reduction is key. Andrew, I really am grateful for the explanation you gave about Africa versus maybe Southeast Asia when you talk about the level of growth and then the length of the growth. I think those are very useful insights. Just a quick point on inflation. Usually we're told in economics that growth is not as important as the drivers of the growth. So if the growth driver is, for example, labor intensive, then you are excited, versus say you grow 14% because you drill oil and it's an enclave economy, so that there isn't really translation to employment. The fact that this growth in Africa is going to be because of inflation reducing and therefore consumer spending means that government spending, for example, which tends sometimes to affect poverty, is not going to be that high. Capital investment spending, which has a higher multiplier effect than consumption spending, is also not doing that well. So in a sense, this growth is tenuous at best. Am I correct?
That's exactly right. So I think, this is the initial recovery is going to be led by private consumption recovery, because inflation has come down. Whenever inflation comes down, it lifts a little bit of pressure off the family budgets, and so they can begin to get a little bit more courageous to spend a bit more, so that is important. But I think the reason why the growth is fragile is precisely because it's hard to imagine this being sustained over long periods of time, right? So over the next few years, I hope what we will see is that investment will recover, and that government investments and government expenditures will also recover. Right now, government spending is subdued because a lot of these countries are still working out their fiscal consolidation, meaning that they're still trying to, get a handle on their spending and their revenues, which have diverged quite a lot during the last 4 years due to pandemic, due to high inflation, and so on. And then what we hope to see is that, investments are going to recover as well. Government investments for sure, but also, investments from private sector in particular, and especially from the private sector, right? So that is important. Now, why is the growth fragile? Well, not only because those two drivers of growth are kind of subdued at the moment, but they're subdued because, first of all, high levels of debt constrain government spending. And I think in the report, what we show is that in 2023, African countries devoted 47% of their revenues, on average, okay? Some bigger, some smaller, 47% to servicing debt. So that's a lot of money that leaves very little to devote to spending on infrastructure, all the needed investments, right? Infrastructure, health, education, water and sanitation, climate action, so on, right? So all those will will be how much you can do in those will be constrained by just the fact that you're spending only almost half, just barely half, a little half, more than half than the of your revenues on these larger needs. And then of course there is there's the fact that a lot of the alternative sources of financing is drying up. So funds, FDI is declining. Loans that have been coming from China have been declining, and commercial creditors that have become a major source of financing for African development in the last few years have basically disappeared. And whenever it has become possible to actually go back to the credit, commercial markets, financial markets, it has been extremely expensive, right? And that is not good for debt sustainability either, right? So that's and then you have conflicts and natural disasters that are making all this.
Stay with the debt question, because you've rightly pointed out that this high levels of our budget going into debt service is really one of the elephants in the room. As I talk to you, Ghana is on an IMF program, Zambia is as well on an IMF program. Don't you think we need to be a bit more forceful about the issue of debt in unlocking the growth of African countries? Because number one, the type of debt we're taking is becoming more commercial. Eurobonds, commercial type debts, not good for a sovereign like Ghana. Should the World Bank not be a bit more forceful about the dangers of the movement into the markets by a lot of these sovereigns, which has led them into this debt trap, right? And also the fact that bilaterals are lower now, concessionary loans are much smaller, just because, for example, a country like Ghana is described as middle income on paper, a lot of the concessional loans reduce. Don't you believe that we need to be a bit more forceful about the effect of debt, the deleterious effects of debt? And the solution is not just decision by sovereigns, but maybe your sister organizations, the IMF and co, can be a bit more prescriptive about the way the debt market is hampering growth in Africa.
So I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's a good thing for countries to have diversified sources of financing, right? One source of financing is not going to be enough, okay? So it's really important for countries to, because the needs of countries are much larger than, whatever financing they can, and, unless you could always, of course, be a country that is got a lot of oil that is demanded by the rest of the world, and you have, or gas, and you have a ton of money, but for most countries, that's not where they are, right? So countries need to have diversified sources of finance. What is more important is not so much about whether, in fact, they should go to commercial finance, is that whether, in fact, it is affordable. And I think the most important thing for countries to keep in mind is the cost of the financing that they're getting and the terms upon which they're borrowing, right? Be very transparent about the terms and try to avoid expensive debt that is short-term, right? Because that whenever there is a shock in the world, and there are always going to be shocks in the world, that affects the interest rates they're paying. If it already is high, it will be even higher, and if with short maturities, it's going to be very, very, very painful. It's going to be a very painful adjustment. So that's what we advise countries to do: is to be very cognizant of, the terms of the borrowing, be transparent about it, and try and avoid the very, very expensive debt that will create all kinds of hardship.
Having said that, is this not time for a big debt relief conversation? I remember in the early 2000s, Ghana was declared HIPIC. We got some debt relief, which was really useful. If you look at the sheer number of African countries, which your report has so beautifully captured, under debt overhang, and the global economy is not stimulating the growth. SSA is an important part of the global economy. Should there not be I take your point around the expensive debt and then the diversification, but is there not need for a big conversation around debt relief of some kind, or a new conversation around a more sustainable debt market? I want to press you on this.
So I think what you notice is that we definitely need a conversation about a way to deal with sovereign debts internationally. We certainly do need that conversation. So I take that. And that, initially there was a mechanism. We didn't have a mechanism before the G20 common framework. So the G20 common framework was the mechanism for resolving the sovereign debt issues, right? Now, the hope was that it will be a forum where, or a framework where, both the debtor and the creditor countries and private commercial creditors will come together and do this, resolve these debt issues quickly and provide substantive kind of resolutions with specific benchmarks. And unfortunately, that has not happened, right? For a variety of reasons. And so there's been a lot of frustration about, the speed at which G20 Common Framework has been able to resolve this. So what we have said in the World Bank is that is still, it's too early to give up on the G20 Common Framework because, different countries have different kinds of issues they're dealing with. Some countries are dealing with real debt solvency problems. In other words, they really cannot pay the debt. And some countries are dealing with liquidity problems, meaning they can pay the debts, but they don't have the cash to pay when the bill is coming due, right? So for those countries, the solution is different than the countries that cannot pay their debt. So for example, recently the World Bank gave debt relief to the World Bank and IMF and the international community gave debt relief to Somalia, right? It was clear that Somalia was not going to be able to pay the debts that they accumulated over many years of failed government or the state. The international community gave Somalia $4.5 billion of debt relief, sort of just wrote that off. But for a lot of countries right now, we're not yet at the stage where we can basically start having a conversation around something equivalent to a HIPIC because, there is this process that is underway. Zambia recently concluded an agreement with its official creditors. Ghana is in the process of negotiating that. Ethiopia the same. So we will see. I think it's important to just wait and see how this evolves, and hopefully that becomes a template for how we actually resolve this debt issue.
And while you can't comment on specific country situations, I need to say to you that in Ghana, prior to the discussion with our external creditors, there was a very painful domestic debt exchange because the government's exposure was not just to foreign creditors, but also to domestic lenders, and people had to take haircuts of both tenure and also of the rate, and it's really damping confidence in the market. So some people feel like even conversations around this debt, the domestic taxpayers, we suffer earlier, we suffer first, and we probably take a bigger chunk. So there's a bigger issue around debt. But let me move to another conundrum that the African countries face. So inflation is coming down and is driving growth. That's great. But you need to strike the right balance because you also need government to spend, right? So for example, government needs to spend on education if we are supposed to reduce our structural imbalances. But the more government spends, the more likely you are to go back into inflation. So I just want your view on how do you balance such a thing where you want to implement the necessary fiscal consolidation measure to let the macro numbers look better, but you also want to avoid the resurgence of inflation, and you also need to drive growth in things like health and education. Talk to me about that balance.
Yeah. So I think, there is not a whole lot of fear when the balance is one where you don't have a huge imbalance between spending and revenues, right? You wouldn't be able to have that kind of thing. So at the moment, I think for a lot of countries in Africa, at the moment, there was this massive imbalance that was built up because of all the spending on the pandemic, all the spending on protecting families and household and businesses during the shock that came from the war in Ukraine and so on. So there was, and that was necessary to do. So I don't want people to misunderstand me and think that I'm opposed to that. No, that was actually important and necessary to do in order to be able to protect the economy from cratering. And households from suffering and do unnecessary hardship. So that was important. But I think now what that has led to is a huge divergence in terms of just revenues and expenditures, and therefore there is it's necessary now to have some consolidation in government revenues and spending, right? So at this point, I don't think that we have any fear in the coming years about inflation being driven again. Going back, unless of course the consolidation is avoided, right? So I completely come to the point that I think the important thing right now is to maintain the consolidation part and avoid basically too much spending again. But that right now is, for a lot of countries, is clear now that they don't have the room to do that, and it's going to lead to a financial crisis if they don't start taking the consolidation part very seriously. So I'm a bit less concerned about inflation returning, unless of course inflation. There are two sources of inflation in Africa, right? So there are of course domestic sources of inflation, but there is also external drivers of inflation, and those are equally worrisome. But hopefully, with inflation coming down in international, advanced economies, you can breathe a little easy that we will have a stable environment going forward. But there's a possibility that in fact any shock now could also then drive commodity prices much higher, and that will lead to higher inflation than we have counted on.
This is still the point of view. We're having a very interesting chat with the Chief Economist for Africa for the World Bank, Andrew Dabalin. When we come back, we'll wrap up with the 4 policy actions that they have prescribed for the continent, and then we'll see if we can make some closure. Stay with us. Welcome back. The point of view tonight is taking an Africa-wide view. We're looking at the Africa Pulse report released by the World Bank. The Chief Economist for Africa, Andrew Dabalin, is talking to us. Really interesting insights on inflation, the trade-offs and all of that. Andrew, before I come to the 4 policy actions at the end of your report, there are so many elections this year. I don't know if that came into, just to give you some highlights. Ghana is voting in December. Mauritania is voting. Chad is voting. Rwanda is voting. Mozambique is voting. Senegal just voted. Botswana is voting. Tunisia, Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, South Sudan, Cape Verde. Did that come in your analysis at all? Because some people think that elections have a way of influencing. For example, in Ghana, every election year, the deficit goes up because government has to spend. Did political risk and elections play any role in this year's polls?
Absolutely. And Ghana is not unusual in that sense. And in fact, Africa is not unusual in that sense, to be honest with you. During elections, policymakers promise all kinds of things. And often we will see, fiscal deficits expand. We will see wage bills go up. You will see all kinds of spending being added onto the budgets. And it's a real risk. So I want to underline that in fact this is a real risk. These are the kinds of policy slippages that are usually potentially, a source of instability, and as you mentioned earlier, a source of inflation and so on and so on. So this is a risk, and we take take note of that when we talk about, the possibility that internal dynamics and macroeconomic policy slippages can lead to lots of risks to stability of the macroeconomy. So that's clear.
That's clear. What about currency? Again, in August last year, actually 2022 August, a lot of countries started having currency challenges. And although there are different reasons for this, there's a strong view that the Fed in the US raising their rate led portfolio investors to essentially opt for more advanced markets. And a lot of African countries had their currencies tanking, and many have not recovered. Now, my question is, what's the way to deal with this kind of exposure to the dollar? I've heard people say, for example, a country like Ghana, you export gold. Why don't you improve your optimal reserve ratio, right? Build your gold reserves so that you, and of course, gold will be stronger than even the dollar, so that you can have a buffer when your currency is challenged to support it. Are there any comments about that currency exposure? Because almost all African countries had currency crisis at least in the past 18 months. Any ideas on that?
So I can't speak specifically to the case of Ghana, but what I would say, or whether gold is a better hedge or not. But what I would say is that what we see, for example, is when advanced economies fight inflation by raising interest rates, which is an important tool for fighting inflation, then what happens is that there is potentially a lot of capital flight from African countries or emerging economies in general. And what that does is to weaken the domestic currencies. And the weakening domestic currencies then, as currencies depreciate, then import costs go high, and inflationary pressures begin to build up in these countries, right? So that's something that we see again and again and again in a lot of these countries, right? Now, the way to deal with these kinds of issues is, of course, first of all, for the monetary authorities in African countries to take action to try and lower inflation. So that may mean basically raising interest rates and cooling the economy, but also it means investing in the long run in the structural reforms that will actually build your productive capacity in the economy in order to be able to diversify your economy and increase your productivity so that you can trade and accumulate much more foreign reserves. That way you can really shield yourself from these kinds of pressures.
Maybe our central banks need to be taking a bit off the hook, because Ghana has raised rates for many, many years. It crowds out the private sector. But the view is that because of fiscal dominance, the tools open to central banks in taming inflation have been proven to be quite ineffective. Is it time economics generally took a second look at its notes in relation to interest rates in informal economies like sub-Saharan African countries? Because I understand if the US raises their rates, what the effect is. But in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and in other parts of the world, the raising of the rates by the central banks don't necessarily lead to reduced inflation, because inflation is not necessarily a monetary phenomenon. Essentially, there are supply side shocks that cause inflation as well. Some of it is imported. What are your thoughts around that?
No, I think the interest rates matter. So we don't want to dismiss that. But you are raising an important point, which is when fiscal dominance is another way of saying basically that the government monetizes a lot of deficits, right? So it's another way of saying that the government basically just prints money to finance its deficits, and that is a bad move at any time, right? So I think part of the reasons why monetary policy may not have an impact in countries which have fiscal dominance is precisely that, right? So the central bankers do their job, but then But the solution to that is to end the fiscal dominance and to be very, very clear about and exercising their independence as a central bank to try and completely blunt the idea of fiscal dominance. So that's a very well understood policy.
Let's end with the policy actions you called for. I see 4 here. Restoring macro stability, I think we all understand that. But you said promoting intergenerational mobility. I don't think I get that. Can you elaborate? What do you mean by promoting intergenerational mobility?
Precisely. Thank you. So if you remember when we talked about inequality, I said that these inequalities are structural. Structural meaning they are things that people don't have control of, and they start early. They start early in life, right? So let's take children. If you take children and they don't have equal opportunity to go to school, equal opportunity to have good nutrition, equal opportunity to have access to health that is important for later on in life, then what you get is lots of inequality when they are adults and they're participating in the market, right? So when they come to the market, then there are all these deficits and all these differences that people, all these inequalities that people come into the market with. And then what happens at that point is that it's impossible then for people to actually be able to exercise and be rewarded for their abilities, right? And that is the fact that these inequalities start early means that a child born to, let's say, a poor family then remains in poverty because they can't compete fairly in the market. A child born in rural area, because they didn't have opportunities to acquire education, as much education as the child born in urban area, right, then is disadvantaged when they come to compete in the market, and therefore they are stuck in poverty, right? So there is no mobility of people from different backgrounds to move from being poor to being better off, right? So as a result, what you get is a society where those who are better off stay better off, those who are poor stay poor, and so there's no mobility across generations. So what we show in the report is if you take a cohort of children who are born in 1980, right, and you look at how much education they got relative to their parents, and only 30% of those children exceeded the education of their parents. And this is in Africa, right? And that's the lowest in the world. So that means that a whole lot of these children had lower education than their parents. And if education is rewarded in the labor market, then they get less rewards than people who have not. And so they can't move up the ladder.
That's beautifully put. The third point was on supporting market access. Again, you need to elaborate, because when we use market access in trade economics, it means a very different thing. Is it the same thing you're talking about in this report? Okay,
so it's similar, but domestically. So let me elaborate that. So inequality starts in life, and then when you come as an adult, you're participating in all kinds of markets. You're participating in credit markets. So you want to start a business, you want to go and get some credit or a loan. You feel like you're a good farmer, you want some access to land markets. If you just want a job, you go to the labor market. So there are all kinds of markets that we participate in, right? And what we notice is that these markets have all kinds of obstacles for people, right? You want to start if you don't start a business, you don't have access to credit. If you go to the labor market, you get discriminated for, whether you're a woman or a man, or whether you come from one region or another, or whether you're connected, your family is connected or not, right? So all kinds of obstacles, right? You go to the land markets. Some places the land markets don't even work, right? They wouldn't rent it to you, and so on, right? So these distortions in the labor market do not allow for entry. One. Two, they misallocate talent. So the people who really are talented are not the ones who are either running businesses or starting them, or tilling the land, right? Or occupying specific positions in the labor market, right? And then what happens as a result of that is that overall productivity and competitiveness and the growth of enterprises and creation of jobs and so on is completely undermined and curtailed, right? So what we are saying is you need to end these distortions to entry, to participation, and so on, right? So remove sometimes these distortions that are related to how big your enterprise is. If you are small, you're discriminated against. There are all kinds of taxes that you have to pay. There are all kinds of fees that you impose. There are all kinds of bans that are imposed, and so on, right? So we need to eliminate those distortions in the market so that people in other words, let's make the market work really efficiently, because that's where talent allocation becomes a powerful driver of growth.
The final point is on ensuring that fiscal policies do not overburden the poor. I hear people say, repeat that, shout more, taxes and more taxes. That's what's happening in Ghana. What's your comment on that? If you say fiscal policy is not overburdening the poor, can you elaborate so we are clear?
So what we find out is that governments have a role to play here. So what I said was that these are inequalities where individuals, you can't leave it to the actions of individuals or to the actions of the market, because those structural inequalities cannot be solved that way. There's a role for social policy. So the social policy, the tool that the governments have is fiscal policy: taxes, transfers, subsidies, investments in education, and so on. So when you look at investments, when you look at fiscal policy in Africa, it actually is very good at reducing inequality. But because inequality is so high, it's second only to Latin America. It's so high that even when they do that, it still will not be able to actually come all the way down to the rest of the world, right? So they just don't have enough fiscal, space to reduce inequality. But when you look at the impact on poverty, fiscal policy actually increases poverty in Africa. So it's regressive in that sense, because African poor pay more in taxes than they actually get in terms of transfers and subsidies, right? And I want to be very careful here. This is purely on terms of this cash, right? It does not include these fiscal policy questions I'm addressing here. Do not include the spending, the in-kind spending that the government does on education and health, right? The free education that's provided, the free healthcare that's provided. If you include that, it probably reverses this issue. But I'm just talking about specifically about the cash part of it, in terms of taxes you pay and the transfers and subsidies that you get. And in that case, African fiscal policies in many countries, not all of them, in some countries is actually penalizing the poor. And so what we are calling for is make sure that when you do this, there is a lot of effort now to try and collect revenue. So domestic resource mobilization is a big agenda in order to try and reduce debt. So part of the effort to try and finance development is to increase domestic resources. If do that, it's really important to make sure that you're cognizant of not harming the poor in the way in which you actually do those reforms.
Brilliant. I mean, it's been amazing talking to you on economics, and you've made it so easy for everybody to follow. Andrew Dabalin, thank you so much for being such an effective communicator of these sometimes abstract ideas that economists try to put across. So we've been speaking to the Chief Economist for Africa for the World Bank, Andrew Dabalin, and he's been elaborating on Africa's Pulse, their latest release for April, and basically saying that we need to tackle inequality to revitalize growth and reduce poverty in Africa. Thank you for your time, sir. I appreciate your time, and to the team at the World Bank for making this happen. That's all we have time for.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. That's all we have time for today's edition of The Point of View. This has been quite a rough ride across the continent, but we hope you've learned something new. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.